Good afternoon again, and thank you for joining us at ERPIC Live. Our topic today is recasting the security of the Eastern Mediterranean. We have with us Dr. Klearchos Kyriagidis, Director of ERPIC's Law and Democracy Program. Klearchos.
Hello.
And Dr. Marios Evriviades, our own international security expert. Marios.
Thank you.
As always, the participants of our discussion express their own personal views. Gentlemen, welcome. Marios, over the last few weeks, the Syrian army and its Kurdish allies are retaking northern Syria. The Turks are threatening to intervene. NATO is poised to support them. And President Medvedev of Russia has cautioned against a set of events that could lead to world war. Is Medvedev right?
Well, I don't think we are headed into a world war in the sense that it has been implied, but we are certainly witnessing in Syria a breakdown of world order, and basically we are seeing a sort of Hobbesian world of a war of all against all. It appears, as you have said, that the Syria and its allies are gaining the strategic momentum, and that augurs well in the sense that we may be heading, even amidst this chaos, towards a stabilization, but this has to happen through some international conference so that legitimacy can be given to whatever it is agreed. So despite the fact that things look chaotic and are chaotic, and we are seeing this new Turkish assertiveness, I sort of don't agree with the implication that NATO may be poised in to come in and help Turkey. I think NATO is, ever since the shooting down of the Russian aeroplane on the 21st of November, NATO has not been very happy with Turkey. And we have seen some signs, but not anything.
Marios, can we look forward to a concert of the Middle East, like the concert of Europe, if you remember in the old days? Is there a historical period that kind of explains the type of dynamics that our region is going through? Are we pre-World War II, pre-World War I? You know, where are we at?
Well, let me just say, this is a loaded question. Let me just say that we may be seeing some sort of agreement between Russia and the United States, specifically at this period on the Syrian issue. But I think the bigger point that the Syrian crisis manifests is that we are coming to the end of an era. And the era I'm talking about is the era, the post-Cold War era. We have had the bipolar world from 1945 to 1990, in which we had an arrangement of the two superpowers basically managing peace in the central area, which is Europe, and having conflict in the periphery, but managing those conflicts. This era ended with the end of the Cold War. From 1990 up until this, the Syrian crisis, and I think the Ukrainian crisis, which is the other side of the Syrian crisis, and we can talk about it if you want, and see how the two are related. With the Syrian crisis, we are seeing an end of an era, and I will explain what I mean by that. Up until the Syrian and Ukrainian crisis, the power of the United States was preponderant, and the United States had the ability to shape the strategic environment. I think the crisis in Syria and the crisis in the Ukraine have indicate that for the first time, actually not since the end of the Cold War, but since World War II, the United States has lost or is losing the ability to shape the strategic environment. In other words, both in the Crimean crisis, in the Ukrainian crisis, which led to the Crimean situation, the Americans tried to bring in Ukraine into the so-called Western system or family, and the reaction from the Russians is basically to take over the Crimea. And to that move, the West had no answer. In the case of Syria, the United States basically tried to play a Libya scenario in Syria. In other words, to bring a regime change in Syria the way they brought the regime change in Libya. How did they bring regime change in Libya? By basically abusing some decisions of the Security Council, which allowed the West to intervene in a humanitarian fashion and basically overthrowing the regime of Gaddafi. Now, they tried to do the same in Syria, and we have seen Russia and China not allowing them to do it through the United Nations, through some sort of legitimacy, because the important thing in everything that is happening in the world, the bottom line is legitimacy. Is what is happening in Syria legitimate or is it not? Yeah. So let me conclude by saying that in the case of Syria, the attempt to bring a forceful regime change or the change of government, if it happens domestically through domestic sources,
that's exactly what I wanted to mention.
It's acceptable.
Because at some point in perhaps the 80s or the whatever, the U.S. made certain decisions that it could and that it was legitimate to pursue regime change. And not just because during the Cold War, there were all these doctrines and the Brezhnev doctrine and the etc.
Carter doctrine and the Eisenhower
that
doctrine.
indicated that if it's a communist regime and it goes communist by itself, then we will intervene to protect it. But perhaps the Chile situation was the first of a calculated regime change, or at least a preempted communization of a regime. But conscious regime change, I think, came into play with Iraq. Because there was a debate, as you know, in the United States with neocons, etc., who were eager to, that it was correct to, in fact, to change the regime of a state that was a rogue state or that exhibited certain characteristics that were not acceptable in the international community and so on. Now, this, it seems, the pendulum has come back the other way, that those experiments of regime change ended up in extreme hardship.
It ended up in a boomerang.
Right, and therefore now there's a tendency again for the international community to err on the side of legitimacy and upholding, as long as the due process is held, the UN and so on, and etc. That it's not so easy to just go in and change the regime.
Well, let me say, just for the sake of history, that you were correct when you said this started in the 80s, and we need to tie this down with the regime change that happened in the Philippines with Marcos.
But also the end of the Cold War.
Well, let me. I just want to give you the historical perspective, because actually regime change, if we really want to be very historical about it, began in the 50s with the regime change in Iran, in Guatemala. Then we have had various attempts of regime change. People don't know this. In Syria, from 1949 through the decade of the 50s, we have had actually a crisis in Syria very similar to the crisis that we are witnessing today between 57 and 58, with the Turkish army on the border ready to invade Syria. But the regime change that people are familiar with these days is the one that tries to bring in the democratic and the humanitarian aspect. Now, in the sense of the democratic, the president is the regime change with Marcos in the Philippines in 1984, if I'm not right, when basically through the work of the Reagan administration and a senator that his name escapes me, but they gave his name a doctrine of a senator that bears the name of a doctrine, Senator Lugar. Senator who was Senate delegate and basically told Marcos, just step down and let's have now that's the president that leads us into the 90s with the fall with the collapse of the Cold War and the idea that democratic governments should be the ones governing the people and not autocratic or dictatorial governments. But as you have said, we have gone and basically what we have done in the post-World War period, we basically tried, or the West basically tried to put aside the United Nations. They tried to put aside the regime that was established since World War II under the United Nations. And what we are witnessing now, in a sense, in Libya and other places.
Why did it? Because it didn't work for the interest of the West?
Well, yes, because they said that
because Bretton Woods was a U.S. invention.
Everything was well. Like I said, the U.S. has been shaping the strategic environment since World War II.
Can I just step in here on the question of regime change? We have to make this point that whenever the British and the Americans have engaged in regime change or a variation of regime change in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, it's tended to backfire on them. I'm thinking of the Suez Crisis in 1956, which had as an ulterior motive the attempt to bring about the downfall of Nasser.
Correct.
It failed spectacularly. The British ended up with egg on their face, and all the rest of it happened. We have then Saddam Hussein in 2003. Again, a spectacular failure, and what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria today is in part a consequence of that. Even you mentioned Iran earlier. The Mossadegh coup,
1953.
The downfall of Mossadegh, 1953, eventually led to the Shah coming to power in 1979. So why have the British and the Americans not learnt the painful lessons of history and supported regime change in effect in both Syria and Libya, particularly since 2011?
Well, I guess there is this presumption in the West that their system is the legitimate system, that everybody seeks democratic governance, and that is true in a sense, and it has shown by the fact that the socialist or the authoritarian regimes, most of them have collapsed. But at the same time, the point is that it cannot be forced from the outside, and it has to happen through internal processes and not by force and by the assumption that you know better than the native.
But surely there's also a Western liberal democratic version, and there is a more Eastern, let's say, a more authoritarian, if you want, or whatever, or democracy that's democratic on the surface, but is actually not democratic at all.
The so-called democracies with Asian values.
Right, and perhaps they're closer than Asia. A lot of the Middle Eastern situations have this characterization. I think it's the Oriental versus Occidental divide where you have the Enlightenment and where the Enlightenment has not yet reached. I think that's the challenge, that sometimes the regime change is aimed at bringing across Western liberal democratic values, but it doesn't do that. At best, it brings an Oriental democracy facade
the so-called
illiberal democracy that is prone to all sorts of abuses. The West comes in to support that, and that's what's happened over the last few years, culminating with the Arab Spring. Because what is the Arab Spring? The Arab Spring is a disillusionment of people of this part of the world with Western liberal values. Disillusionment, why? Not with the values themselves, but with their application, because they were never applied properly to places like Egypt, etc., etc.
Or to places like Saudi Arabia. Now,
Absolutely.
We have now...
But Saudi Arabia is a sui generis kind of a situation. It's a little kingdom, it's, etc. It's a little kingdom with a super ability to affect international affairs, as it seems, because it has the financial clout to do this. But anyway, that's another category.
Yes. But when you are having an alliance which wants to bring democratic regime change, and your instruments or your instrumentalities are the regime of Saudi Arabia or the Kuwaiti regime, what kind of moral standard are you applying?
Well, certainly not your own Western moral standard. But I think then that's the
so maybe we need to scratch down from the surface and see what are the geopolitical imperatives that are work here, and not this facade of
that's always those
democratic
dynamics that I was talking about. In other words, it's you have to deal with certain dynamics. Some of them are demographic, some of them are geopolitical, some of them are ideological. I mean, now you've got the religious fundamentalism thrown in the mix. And sorry, go ahead.
But Christodoulos, the deeper point I'm trying to make with regards to the end of an era, in other words, the end of the post-Cold War era, and we are going into a new era now. And your question, what kind of system are we getting into? What we are witnessing is going back to the future. In other words, we are either going back to the pre-World War II era or to the pre-World War I era. In other words, we are moving into a multipolar system. And multipolar systems are good in a sense that they prevent hegemonism and one country dominating other countries. At the same time, they are much more vulnerable to conflict and imbalances that could lead to a general war. In that sense, maybe Mendevi may be right. We are moving into a very dangerous world, and it's difficult to make.
Marius, earlier you mentioned that NATO, to some extent at least, mistrusts Turkey. And you've also mentioned the pre-First World War era. This is quite interesting. If you look at the late 19th century and the early 20th century in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, you had the breakdown of the Anglo-Turkish relationship, which was part of the Crimean War and post-Crimean War period, and you had the crystallization of a Turkish-German alliance. And what you're seeing in this part of the world today is the re-emergence of a Turkish-German alliance, strains in the Turkish relationship with the United Kingdom.
Can one go so far as to call it an alliance, though?
Well, with Germany.
Yeah.
Well,
are we overstepping the definition?
Well, they are allies in NATO, both of them.
Yeah, sure.
But
is there a special relationship?
Well, there is a special relationship going back to the post-1878 period when the British and the Turks entered into what was called the Convention of Defensive Alliance that was supposed to help Turkey beat off the Russians with the help of the British. And the British were hoping that that was going to create the beginning of a new era of Anglo-Turkish friendship, and it ended up producing a new era of Turkish-German friendship, which eventually led to the First World War and the formation of a Turkish-German alliance against the British, and interestingly enough, against the French and the Russians too. And we're seeing sort of a variation of this.
Let there be no misunderstanding. When I said NATO does not trust Turkey, Turkey is a member of NATO,
yes,
long-standing member of NATO. What the NATO allies are uncomfortable with is a lot of the Turkish initiatives taking place in the Middle East climaxing with which was a planned shooting down of the Russian airport, Russian plane, which was, in terms of NATO potentially confronting Russia, a very provocative act, because it could have led into situations that are uncontrollable. And the first NATO session that occurred right after the shooting down of the plane was a very hostile session against Turkey, because the people were saying, we have an alliance to support each other, and decisions on such important matters are taken within the alliance. Of course, there is a devil theory that this was all organized and planned. But at any rate, it was a very risky situation, which, of course, created the opposite effect from the one plan. It brought the Russians firmly into the area. The Russians established a no-flying zone over Syria instead of what NATO and especially Turkey wanted. And that, of course, created the new strategic situation on the ground.
There was a different dynamic, because what you say is interesting. I mean, that period of British-Turkish cooperation leading to German-Turkish, etc. But that period was the period of Ottoman decline.
Yes.
Now is a period of neo-Ottoman ascendance. And a declining power generates a different dynamic than an ascending power.
Well,
and perhaps it's debatable which is more dangerous.
It may lead to the same consequences.
It may lead to the same consequences, or it may not. It may not lead, however, to the same reactions of other powers, because they view a declining power as perhaps an opportunity, a fishing opportunity, and an ascendant power as a different proposition.
I have to say here that back in 1914, the Turks ended up, with the help of the Germans, ended up bombarding the Russians in the Black Sea. In late October 1914, that resulted in a British declaration of war against Turkey on the 5th of November 1914, and on the same day the British annexed the island of Cyprus and asserted sovereignty over Cyprus. And a few days later, we mustn't forget this, the Ottoman Empire and Caliphate, and I emphasize the word Caliphate here, the Ottoman Empire and Caliphate declared a jihad against the non-German Christian nations of the world that were attacking.
Why did it differentiate between the German and the non-German?
Because the Germans were on the side of the Turks, so the jihad had to be limited to the primarily the British, French, and the Russians.
But they were presumably just as heathen as the rest of us.
I mean, I can't. I'm not an expert on jihad.
On caliphate,
but
spin.
The point is, this is the point I'm coming to, that the so-called caliphate that was declared on the 30th of June 2014 is in a sense an attempt to revive the old caliphate that was dismantled at the end of the First World War by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So my question to Marios is, to what extent should we in Cyprus and in the rest of the European Union be concerned by the emergence of this so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq?
Well, we should be concerned in terms of the theology or ideology of Islamic fundamentalism, because in their view of the world, everything has been predetermined. Everything is in the Quran. We all are Muslims and we don't know it, and that eventually we'll die Muslims. And those
one way or the
other, and the extreme version of jihadism says that if you do not voluntarily become a Muslim, then we'll force you to become a Muslim. But in terms of actually what is happening now in the Middle East and in terms of the jihadist fundamentalism, I have always argued that if those who were fighting against Islamic fundamentalism tried to contain it even within the area that it declared as a caliphate. The areas in Syria and Iraq that have been under its control.
They're shrinking, though.
Well, of course, it's shrinking, and if you study the history of
Or is it shrinking?
Or, excuse me.
The Russians want to say that it's shrinking. Is it shrinking?
Well, it is shrinking. It is happening materially. They are losing their territorial control. So today in the morning, I just checked the internet. The Syrian army or the Syrian alliance is moving towards Raqqa. The Turks are desperate because the Turks have a de facto alliance with ISIS. Nobody wants to say it publicly, but it's there. Everybody knows it. Everybody presents that, especially Turkey's Western allies pretend that this is not happening. But the point of fact is that the control of the fundamentalists, the territorial control is shrinking. And I was saying that even if they were allowed, without going through this process of the war, if they tried to contain them, it would have happened anyway, because the history of the history of the caliphates tells us the same story. They basically kill each other and they eliminate each other. Most of the caliphs have been killed by those claiming their throne. So it was a matter of time, I think. But at any rate, it needed to happen because of the...
This is true of most kings, though. They're always killed by
the king is dead, long live the king. But it's not... but I want to make another point, if I may, in terms, because it's true that we may be moving into a multipolar era. Yeah. But the difference between the multipolar eras prior to World War II and after World War II is that as a consequence of World War II and the United Nations system that has been established, the use of force and the acquisition of territory by force it's very difficult, it's impossible to legitimize. So therefore, if we try to look at the day after in our region, because there is a lot of speculation whether new countries will emerge, whether there will be a new Kurdish state or more than one Kurdish states and things like that. I find it very difficult. I find it it would be very difficult, I think, for established territorial lines, the lines that were set up by imperialists during 1916 by the famous Sykes-Picot lines that have established the modern Middle East, in a sense, whether those lines would change. What we'll probably see is more autonomy within Syria, within Iraq, more tribalization.
Yeah. Well, the tribalization is interesting because will you see, does this mean that we're seeing less tribalization and more a sort of back to an enduring sense of nationalism? And if so, what is so appealing of nationalism?
I think we're going through a phase of tribalization, but
there's always a pendulum effect.
One who knows history knows that the Middle East has always been tribalized. I mean, let's say an attempt was made after World War II to build up national states in the Arab world. I think with the exception of Egypt, who has a long tradition, a long history, and is a state, most of the other
and Iran for that.
Iran is not an Arab state.
No, sure. No, but it's a player in the region.
No, of course it's a player in the region, but it's not an Arab state.
Sure.
So with Egypt, Syria in a sense, because Syria is the birthplace of Arab nationalism. So what I think we're witnessing now is we're going to go through this process of intense tribalization, but I think we'll be coming back to nationalism, ethnic nationalism. It's a contradiction in terms, if we talk about nationalism in the Middle East, if we include in the religion, Islam. But there are indications that in Iraq, for example, the old Ba'ath remnants are reestablishing themselves into a sort of an Iraqi nationalistic core. And the idea is that once this thing settles, that Iraqi nationalism will be emerging, and probably Syrian nationalism. The only problem with this kind of nationalism is that most of the supporters are Sunni Arabs, and the idea now is how to also end this Sunni Shiite conflict, which sometimes dominates completely.
Yeah.
Just on that, is there a bias in the international system towards nationalism?
Well,
so is it the reemergence, therefore, of nationalism is a sort of a structural, deterministic effect?
There is a bias in the national system because most national states, which are the players of the international system, are national states. Most of them.
States.
And it's the nation state.
Well, this leads neatly to the point I was going to make. Here in the Republic of Cyprus, we are on the southeast edge of the European Union, and there's an attempt now to create a constitutional settlement which will tribalize or re-tribalize this part of the European Union with this so-called bicommunal, bizonal federation. We've mentioned earlier the pre-1914 concept of Europe era and the Cold War. The major difference, or one of the major differences between those two eras and today, is that we have in many European nation states, if I can use that phrase, growing Muslim minorities, which have elements within them which are unfortunately afflicted by this tribalization culture. We've also seen the events in Paris on the 13th of November, the bloodbath, which is a spillover of what we're seeing in Syria and Iraq. So the question I have is, do you agree with me that a major change with the previous eras is that the Middle East is now not only important for Europe, but the Middle East is becoming increasingly a part of Europe through the changing demographics?
I think.
And if so, what are the consequences for the security of Europe?
Well, this is actually the biggest question. We are seeing its consequences in the inability of the European Union, or even in individual national states in Europe, but the European Union as a whole, to handle this crisis. A lot of it has been brought on the European Union. Of course, there is the legacy of imperialism and colonialism, because a lot of the presence of non-Western people is a consequence of European legalism and imperialism. And in one sense, one can say that the chickens are coming home to roost. But this recent phase is basically a consequence of the wars in the Middle East, because we are having a massive influx of refugees into Europe. One would say that if these were happening over a period of time, because you're from England, you have had a lot of England has had a lot of communities from India, from Pakistan, from Cyprus, third and fourth generation, which in many ways have been acclimatized into the community. Now this impact is happening very suddenly, and it's happening under these circumstances of Muslims feeling persecuted and attacked, and therefore the reaction is the one that we are seeing. And it takes an extremist form. I am at a loss to say how this can be handled.
Well, my response is the way you handle this is you embrace the values of liberal democracy and the rule of law. Equality under the law, non-discrimination, inclusion, integration, respect for human rights.
That spells assimilation, and it's not happening.
And it's not happening. And what the great danger is that the European Union is gradually surrendering its values. I mean, here in Cyprus, instead of supporting liberal democracy and equality and non-discrimination and integration, they're supporting the separation of Christians from Muslims under a bicommunal, bizonal settlement and coexistence. Now, in Europe, if this model, in other words, what is Cyprus? I argue Cyprus is either a bulwark that's going to end up propping up liberal democracy, democratic values and the rule of law, or it's going to be a domino that will topple and result in knock-on effects in the rest of Europe. Do you agree with me?
Klearchos, you are making a very, very important point in the sense that as I tried to argue, the previous generations of immigrants in a place like England, let's stick to England, that came in from the prior to World War II, but in the aftermath, especially of World War II, these were people that fought in the armies to defeat the Nazism, to defeat the racialism and all these things. And they came into a place like England, and I think, correct me please, most of them assimilated. The problem now is that it's happening suddenly and it cannot be handled. In the case of Cyprus, we have had a tradition of coexistence and acculturization and assimilation in Cyprus, which in fact...
That's a different thing. Acculturization and assimilation.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, maybe...
No, you're right to because they're side by side. They're two characteristics.
A culture of tolerance has been established in Cyprus over the years, which was forcefully and suddenly broken up by the events, especially...
I'm not sure if it's fiction or reality, because there's a lot of this idea that everything was hunky-dory.
No. I'm not saying that. No, people were not in love with each other. I'm not saying that.
And you also had self-segregation in the Turkish quarters.
They were not on each other's throats, and they were not. At any rate, the point is that Cyprus can be used as an example of integration, and as an example for Europe. In fact, it's not happening, and they are reinforcing this segregation and basically racialism in the form of an umbrella of bicommunalism and
well, can I just
on this? Go ahead, but it's something.
It's just a footnote to what you were saying, Marios. You mentioned my British background. Well, I'm very concerned that in the United Kingdom we actually have a government department called the Department for Communities and Local Government. Communities in the plural. So the tribalization that we've been talking about in the Middle East has not only spilled over into the United Kingdom, but it's actually, in a sense, being reflected in the name of a government department. It should really be the Department of Community or Society and Local Government. So this is something I tell my British friends if they're listening here. We need to support the principles of integration and assimilation over and above the principles
there's a problem exactly, and you've led me right to it.
Division.
To this comment. The philosophy behind the integration of the European Union is one not of assimilation, because you don't want to make French people into Germans. It's respect and
of
integration of the differences
and toleration.
And toleration of diversity. Now, if that's your governing philosophy, you cannot then say, for the immigrants, wherever they step off or wherever they end up in Europe, we're going to assimilate them. We're going to force them to assimilate. No, you're practicing the same standard, and therefore you allow them to have their group individuality and their customs and their culture and so on. The problem is that in these cases, there's an abuse of that tolerance, because the immigrants are not part of the original system. And let's face it, what was the original system? Western enlightened Christianity. I don't mean to be religious here. But if you come from a different tradition, and it could be Oriental Christianity or something, it doesn't have to be Muslim or something else, then holding on to your culture and your traditions is disruptive of the whole European experiment. Because all European experiment is hang on to your individuality as long as it doesn't really upset the total, because the total is more or less the same, but individuality is something, then it gives it some spice, let's say. In this case, in the case where the spice is so strong, the spice turns into a poison. And this is what you're having. You're having, the spice of diversity turn into a killing potion, because it's threatening the core. Now, I think that dichotomy has not been resolved in the European mind, and I don't think it's being addressed either.
Can I just ask Marios on this thing?
Do you agree? Do you guys agree on this, or think it's totally off the wall?
Well,
I would just say before Marios steps in, we made a terrible mistake in Britain. We allowed the emergence of faith schools. So you can have a Muslim school, a Jewish school, you now even have a Greek Orthodox school scattered around the country. And so the tribalization is actually creating a milletization, to use an Ottoman expression, the milletization of the United Kingdom. We have communities scattered all over the place, faith schools scattered all over the place. And this is inimical to the emergence of an integrated society under the rule of law. It's a massive problem that we need to address in Europe. I'd be interested, though, to ask Marios.
Well, I want to make two comments. One is to shift gears and go to the United States and see that we have all kinds of immigrants in the United States from all over the place. We even have an indigenous Muslim people there, a reaction of the black people against the abuse of whites.
The philosophy is to become American.
Excuse me?
There, the philosophy was always to become American.
Precisely. So there is the American identity, and underneath that, a very colorful diversity, ethnic. In fact, it's fashionable to be ethnic in the United States, things like that. Now, why couldn't Europe, or why can't Europe bring that about? The reason why, because Europe is not a political union. It's still a situation in evolution, and it seems that the evolution doesn't seem to be going.
The idea of being a European hasn't been elevated to a national level. You don't feel a national European. You feel European culturally, but you feel British or German or whatever.
Yes, but that brings us to another
the concept of Europeanism hasn't been elevated to the level of nationalism.
That's the debate.
It could eventually, but I'm not sure it's going to go that way.
Well, I don't know if it could. You know why? Because there is another issue, and now we're shifting gears a lot here, but there is another issue with regards to Europe and the European integration and the European Union, etc., etc., etc. And this, which has been emerging, and this is the idea of the lack of accountability and democracy within the European Union,
absolutely.
And the total and the total condescending attitude of European bureaucrats. Why hasn't the European Parliament,
or as they call them, Brussels-crats,
whatever, who live on salaries and expense accounts that are not
audited properly.
Nothing. But the whole idea that they know better than the European peoples, who are people who have a long tradition and history with democratic struggles and evolution of human rights. So the reason why the European Union at some point stopped and is not moving anywhere has a lot to do with the structure and the ideas that are pervasive within the bureaucracy. So that's a big issue, because otherwise the idea of Europe is to actually bring out all the differences. In fact, most of the languages, a lot of the European languages that have disappeared are coming back now.
The diversity is an
But
important
the
part
other
of the
issue,
experiment.
because like I said, we're entering into a lot of very sensitive. The other issue with regards to the integration and the assimilation or whatever of the Muslim communities, because that's what it boils down to, has to do with how the Muslim faith and the Quran is understood and perceived by people. Because there are those who say that it can allow tolerance and allow diversity, and there are those who say that that's not the case, and that therefore either you do it the Muslim way or you have to give up. So there is a big issue there and a big debate which is not being properly discussed, and by the way, Klearchos, it's not at all addressed in Cyprus. The importance of religion. Everybody puts it under the rug. They think that if we find a domestic solution to the governance, that's it, and that everything will be implemented. And this issue is totally ignored, and nobody is making any issue of the fact that the whole occupied area is being filled up with mosques and religious schools. What's the future with those?
Relating this concepts of Europe back to the Middle East, would you say that there's a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding or a lack of comprehension of what's going on in this part of the world, structurally and dynamically? The answer of both of you. But
what we're
you're
seeing,
more familiar with Britain, let's say, is it? But Britain always has been savvy about the region, has a sense about the Eastern Med and the Middle East. Even Britain now is out of touch or out of sync.
We're slipping into I call it a neo-militarization in the United Kingdom. There are two questions that the whole of Europe has to ask itself in this dramatic new era that we're in. The first is, how do we integrate everybody, irrespective of ethnicity or religion? Is Cyprus the model whereby you constitutionally separate people into Christians and Muslims and call them two communities? Because this phrase two communities is just a fig leaf. You strip away the fig leaf, it's Christian and Muslim. Is that the way you do it, by separating people constitutionally and zonally, which is the other side of bicommunalism? Or do you do it through integration, through a multi-ethnic, multi-faith society? I would prefer a multi-faith, multi-ethnic society across the European Union. Look at the presidential candidates in the United States of America. You've got Cuban Americans, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. You've got a woman in Hillary Clinton. You've got a Jewish American in Bernie Sanders. You've got the WASPs represented by Donald Trump and one or two of the others. I mean, that's how it should be. We should embrace diversity in the European Union, but we should also enshrine diversity in our constitutional systems.
And coming,
and that's the one of the great.
This is the point. But again, I want to hear your view about the European take about the Middle East and what's happening here. I mean, is it? I mean, we don't understand what's happening around us, so let alone the Europeans. But I mean, we're reaching for some sort of system that's going to be established by default or by design in this, or could be established by default or by design in this part of the world. One model would be that the states which are very nationalistic, like Turkey and Iran and so on, are going to be dominant in this tribal region. They're going to be able to, and Egypt for that matter, if it gets its economic and other sense, and Israel. So do these strong nation states have an advantage over, have a built-in advantage in this part of the world? Or can you see something different? I mean, looking over the horizon, what system do you see established in this part of the world?
Well, let me say that first of all, irrespective of some reservations that people may have, the most important strategic development in the Middle East is the return of Iran into the gradual return of Iran into the international system, which means that Iran will be conducting business with Europe, with Russia, with a lot of countries, which means that the behavior of Iran will be more congruent and more sort of more normalized in a sense. I don't like the word, but I can't think of one or another at this point. So Iran is a critical country in the Middle East. It is, as you said, nationalistic country, and you mentioned Turkey and its nationalism, and therefore you have a balancing situation between these two countries. I like balances. Egypt is a strong national, it has a very strong identity, and therefore we also have a strong country there. You mentioned Israel too. So if there is a balance, I'm all for balances. And where there is a balance, even weaker countries, not smaller countries, and I want to emphasize the point that there are no big and small countries in the international system. There are strong countries and there are weak countries. And what do the weak countries do to compensate for their weakness? They create alliances and they create cooperation. And this is what's happening, by the way, to end up with our region, Mr. Pelagias, the Eastern Mediterranean region. What we are witnessing here is the establishment gradually of a cooperation between Cyprus and Egypt, between Cyprus and Israel, between Cyprus, Greece and Israel, it involves Jordan. Eventually, it involves Lebanon. The other day, the Cypriot foreign ministers met in a second or third time. So what we're witnessing is the building of a regional system here, a sub-regional system that will play its role in this bigger system that you talked about in terms of the bigger countries, with their participation. And based on this energy situation that is evolving, I think we have a chance to develop a cooperation here that can produce both wealth, peace, and security. And
so it is a concert of the Eastern Med emerging.
Correct.
In the background of this cacophony.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, I've got it.
Now, but what do you need to establish it? It's not just random little meetings.
No, let me say very quickly.
Sorry,
let me say very quickly. We have the time. We have a few minutes. There are already in place.
Can you institutionalize?
Two very important peace treaties in the region. Let's not forget about them. There is a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, 1979, and there is a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, 1994. I think those are the building stones, the cornerstones on which to build. You can build it individually and then eventually bring all these people together. There is, I think, there are a number of developments. Well, a lot of people say energy is a catalyst, but there are also other developments, I think, in the region that could eventually build this up. And I look forward to the Eastern Mediterranean becoming an autonomous strategic region that can produce its own policies and its own security and its own wealth.
There's a very important point that needs to be made here about the Republic of Cyprus in this concept of an Eastern Mediterranean concert, if we can use that phrase. Cyprus is unique for various reasons. It has membership of the European Union, which Greece has as well, but Israel and Egypt and Jordan don't. Cyprus is a member of the Council of Europe, which Turkey is a member of, Greece is a member of, but the rest of the region isn't. But Cyprus has something else. It's a member of the Commonwealth. It has a special relationship with the British, has a special relationship with India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So if Cyprus has the potential, if things play out sensibly, Cyprus has the potential to really be the pivot in this
overlapping circles.
In these overlapping circles, and bring all of those institutions to the region for the benefit of the region, for the benefit of democracy, and ultimately for the benefit of the people.
Which means, Claire, host, that any solution must not take away Cyprus's ability to act as a player, as an autonomous player within the constraints of the international system. Because any other solution that would place Cyprus under the dominance of any other country is a solution that will create more problems than prospects for peace and security.
That leads perfectly into the question that I wanted to ask you. In this background of fluidity and uncertainty and so on, is it better for Cypriots to reach boldly for a solution and a supranational settlement, or is it better to wait and see the results of all this dynamic situation that's around them? Is it better to err on the side of caution and wait for the storm to settle, or is it an opportunity now for us to reach for a settlement?
Well, Christodoulos, any crisis, you know, the cliche goes, any crisis is an opportunity, etc., etc., etc. I would have no objections provided that certain things are retained and negotiated and the primary thing which I implied in my previous answer is that Cyprus must retain its ability to decide its own future. If that were to happen, yes, but at the same time we see this the whole area is in a total
but who is Cyprus? The Greek Cypriots or the Turkish Cypriots?
Cyprus should be the citizens of the Republic.
Is the Cypriot state. It's the citizens, it's the Cypriot state, and Cyprus, let us say for another time, is the satrapy of no country. Cyprus is an autonomous player in the international system.
It should be the satrapy of no country.
It is, and it shouldn't be, and it should not be allowed to be made a satrapy. And those who make Cyprus a satrapy to any state will have to live in terms of their own legacy. Have to live with that legacy.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.